start with a story. A story about a girl, and trust me, I will sprinkle in some magic into this whole story. So, growing up, my parents have always thought that the best way to teach my brother and I things is not really just to tell us the facts and tell us certain things, but actually show us things. So, one of the biggest teachings that my parents have given me is that, when you just see things, you can't really see the true meaning that they have, but instead you really have to explore them. So what they did is that they brought us to the one place in the world where, when you look at something, you generally don't know the whole meaning of a thing because it has a lot more meaning than what it's entitled to have. So I'm talking about Easter Island. When I was 6 years old, my parents flew my brother and I to Easter Island to discover a whole new perspective and to really encounter what magic is like. I walked out of the plane, and what's the first thing I saw? This big statue. Now, throughout the island, there's over 1,000 of these statues called the Moais. These statues weigh more than 14 tons. So, as you can imagine, how is it humanly possible for someone to even carry a statue like this? Of course, in my 6-year-old brain, I didn't really think of it that way. But I asked my mom, like, you know what? How can someone even carry something like this? To my surprise, her response was very accurate. She said, well, it's magic. And luckily, a few days later, I discovered that my mom had friends in the island that actually told me the true meaning behind this mais. And well, Rapa Nui folk legends tell the story of Hotomatua, who is the great Ariki or wizard that came from the island of Hiva 1,000 years ago and came with a certain power that he brought to the island. He had this power where he could move things with one arm. So imagine this great wizard that can just move things with one arm and shift them from place to place. Now, that's a crazy power. So he could move the waves, he could move stones, and what old folk Rapa Nui legends tell us is that, he was the one and only wizard, and well, he transmitted his power to other wizards, but he was the one and only who could actually move these statues. Now, this is a belief that is shared in Easter Island by the islanders. And I'm not here to either tell you to believe it or not, but I'm here just to expose culture to you and tell you, this is a belief that people share. And you know what? It's not generally shared through people because it's the belief of the supernatural. And now in the 21st century, we generally reject this idea of the supernatural since we don't really have facts to admit it. But I just want to share with you the idea that maybe the supernatural shares aspects of culture that sometimes are hidden. So, as an example of me discovering this belief of magic in Easter Island and how this belief of moving mice from one side to another with magic can just shape cultures, it also shaped my way of thinking. So, I'm gonna talk to you guys about how I discovered the supernatural through studying it and looking at different case studies. So, for my extended essay, I decided to write about supernatural beliefs and specify it on witchcraft. Now, in order to decide what witchcraft is and decide what the supernatural is, I had to find some categories and categorize these supernatural beliefs into them. So these categories are categories that supernatural cases have within them. So if a country has these categories, they're generally like exposed to supernatural generally. So the first category is that countries that generally have supernatural cases within them have flora and fauna. So they have an appreciation to this flora and fauna kind of aspect. Another characteristic is that the government generally accepts the idea of an existing supernatural belief, or maybe the culture having a basis upon a supernatural idea. Another idea is that, there's no difference between the good and evil. So the idea of the good and evil doesn't exist, bad magic or good magic. It's magic that exists. And also an idea is that, religion and the supernatural beliefs are generally fluid. So this idea of fluidity comes that sometimes religion and the supernatural work hand in hand instead of just both of them contrasting. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna talk to you about different cases of this supernatural and talk to you about the power of tolerance and how maybe the supernatural belief exists or not, but how we're losing culture nowadays because people reject the idea of cultures having this supernatural belief. So this idea of toleration is just completely disappeared because now we completely reject the idea of cultures having a supernatural basis. Because right now, who's gonna tolerate facts that we can't really rely upon? So as a case study, I'm first gonna look at Chile. Now, we live in Chile, but now, what do you really think about when you think of Chile? We can think of this, our great view. We can think of this, the Araucanía. But when I think on Chile, I think about this. Now, you know, we can see a lot in the news how the Mapuche culture has a great influence on Chilean conflicts, and sometimes the Mapuches are rejected upon by the government. But now, the Mapuches also are part of our culture. So, what I thought about is why are they commonly rejected? And as I was looking at it, I realized that they're generally rejected because their culture just draws different ideas to us. So, for example, the Mapuches, their culture has a basis on the supernatural. So they believe in witchcraft, they believe in machis, they believe that herbs can cure us. So looking back on the characteristics I was sharing with you, the Mapuches do have an acceptance for the flora and the fauna. They do they do believe that the supernatural and religion are fluid, and they also believe that there's no difference between the good and the evil. But one aspect that sometimes is not really touched upon, and it's in the categories that I mentioned, is that the Mapuche culture, well, I don't know if they have the acceptance of the government. Now, that is not to say that, the government doesn't recognize them as such, but sometimes they're not supported by the government. So, of course, this can result in the loss of these supernatural ideals. Because if they don't have the people's support, of course, how are they gonna progress this natural ideals? And how are they gonna progress their culture? This rejection of the Mapuche culture just really results on the complete loss of their culture and the complete loss of knowledge that we could gain from learning about these supernatural beliefs that, once again, I'm not trying to tell you that they can either exist or not, but it's culture that can be gained and we can learn so much from it. I also want to give you another case study, and I want to fly you all the way to Africa. I want to talk about sub-Saharan Africa. Now, once again, when you think on Africa, what do you think about? Think on this, think on this, but I generally think on this. Now, Africa, I think, is a great example of how national identity is really held together to, well, the continent as a whole. There was poll held a few years ago in Africa that was asking people through sub-Saharan Africa, do you believe in the supernatural? Now, what they answered was that 50% of them said that, yes, I do believe in the supernatural. And then 75 of them said that they do believe in some aspect of the supernatural, but not others. So this just shows us that the supernatural is existent in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's a part of their culture. I really believe that Africa holds their culture together and holds it very closely knit to them. So them believing their traditions and keeping their traditions alive is part of how they really continue believing in the supernatural culture that's within them. Now, going back to these characteristics I was sharing with you, in sub-Saharan Africa, they do have an appreciation for the flora and the fauna. Most of its supernatural beliefs are part of it. Also, they do see a difference, they do see not much of a difference between the good and the evil. And also, it can be seen that in African kingdoms, this belief of the supernatural and religion are very fluid as they go together and they're not divided. But now, once again, there is a conflict. Now, it's been now 10 years that countries throughout sub-Saharan Africa have been hunting witches because they believe that witchcraft hurts their societies. Now, I'm not saying that the supernatural only entails witchcraft, but as people assume that the supernatural only talks about witchcraft, they've been having this witch hunt throughout all countries in Africa. And now what does this result in? Well, it results in the loss of culture. And now, this loss of culture has great impacts because one of the continents that I believe really holds their traditions together is now losing their traditions completely because governments are not allowing these traditions to spread. Now, that is terrible because I believe that cultural loss can really hurt us and can hurt us in generations to come. So now, I believe that there are ways to shift this ideal that culture loss won't always be culture loss, that we can, shift paradigms. But it's important to work together. I think that if we teach people to be more accepting about different cultures and, embrace the idea of culture and not really always look for the facts, not always look for information that entails a certain research, I think that go we'll earn a lot. Now, I also believe that teaching acceptance to people about different cultures is necessary. You know, when you look at a culture, you don't have to look at it with rejection, but instead, you have to embrace it. You have to embrace the idea and accept it. I think that this is a really big idea that we have to share to people. Now, I think that this can be hard, and I'm not telling you that, when we lose culture, we lose it forever and we can't get it back because I think that people can shift their ideas. But I also believe that this loss of culture has just affected us in so many ways. And just because the supernatural belief is something that you can't see or something you can't rely upon because it's not there, it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be recognized as such. Now, I just want to talk to you about how this idea of, this girl who went to Easter Island and she discovered what magic is really like shifted to look at, these bigger examples of the world of Chile and in sub-Saharan Africa and see, how we look at the world and sometimes we discover things that we don't really know because we are so selective about the culture and the things we learn upon. Now, I want to really invite you guys to embrace this idea of differences and embrace this idea of, accepting that not all cultures are alike and to learn about different cultures and not always look for, the facts and what's scientifically proven and what's this and what's that, but instead to embrace culture because as we lose culture, we're also losing national identity. And I think national identity is key for countries to progress. So thank you.